Hello. So, I'm in my office, and I wanted to talk to you about the benefits of variable labeling. So, basically, the idea is that we, as a research community, can benefit a lot, I would say, from standardizing variable labels and using them in the data sets that we upload. This makes everything better, in my opinion. Basically, there are a lot of new data sets that are being uploaded, but they are oftentimes quite messy and they're difficult to reuse. And the idea is that if we can standardize the labels, it would make them better. Because basically the reason that they're hard to use is because people don't put metadata. And when I open up a data set that's not mine, it's like, what do these variable labels mean? What do these numbers in the data set mean? What is all this stuff? Yeah? And if we can standardize the labels, it removes that problem, because suddenly I can look up the variable label and I can see directly, okay, it's this question from this scale with these words. It matches with this variable on the data set. And these are the scales, the scale labels, for instance. I got a little itch here. Anyways. And what I want to suggest, what I do suggest, is that the variable labels be set at the introduction of the scale. So when when I publish a new scale, I set the questions, the number of questions, the wording of the questions, the scale labels of the questions, a lot of things about the scale. But in the current situation, I am not setting any sort of standard variable labels. But if I, in the same publication that I publish the scale, also set standard labels, it sets the standard and it sets a norm for anybody who uses that scale in the future. Yeah, and that's very simple. That's a very clear, easy way to do it, I would say. And the key is, when I set that standard, it makes it easier for me and you to reuse the data, first of all, but also, for instance, I have a standard way of creating a factor score. And if I can basically create an analysis script that creates that factor score and then make it available on a data repository or an analysis script repository, and then you can directly download that, it makes it much easier for you to use the scale, I would say. In the current situation, or at least, how it is in most situations, basically people, they say, oh, these are the questions, and they give some small indication of how they load onto a factor, or how to combine the variables so that it's working. But this, you could directly, do you see, normally you go to a paper, you look at the scale, it says, oh, we take the average, or, oh, these are the factor scores. It's not very specific about how the factor is created, etc., etc. Here, I can go to the repository, download the analysis script directly, and already, hopefully, not only have the variable labels, but to be able to upload my own into it. Very simple, very clear. And as a benefit, you can compare, right? So I have this in the repository, large data set, base case. They have some data that they originally collected. Other people have uploaded their data sets into that database, so you can aggregate, this data can be aggregated, and you can compare your results against theirs, I would say, quite easily and automatically. It's even in theory, these are all, in the future, but you could even create a package that runs and creates the the scale, and it could automatically, for instance, pull all of the data from repository X and compare your data against that data to see if it's normal, to see if maybe you screwed up the scale labels, all of this kind of stuff. I think it's a one size fits all solution. I think it's really a useful thing. The key is creating variable labels that are actually useful. And in that regard, I'm not an expert on these things, but I haven't seen this solution presented elsewhere, so I wrote about it. But again, I'm really not an expert on methodological things. I'm a psychologist, I would say, and in that regard, I think I do have an idea about how to help or make it easier for people to implement and use the solution. The keys are it has to be simple, right? I mean, you read my paper from a while ago about how we need to keep the scientist in mind, the psychology of the scientist in mind in any of these solutions, because basically if it doesn't make sense to the scientist, if it's frustrating, if it's hard, if it's annoying, they're not going to do it. So the variable labels need to be useful, easy, short, all of this kind of stuff. And the way that I'm suggesting to do that, and I don't know that it's the perfect way, but I think it's a very good way, is to have an abbreviation of the scale label. So let's say the example that I use in the paper is the Rosenberg self-esteem scale. Now if you take something like self-esteem, that's already pretty short. Self-esteem, it's like, 10 letters, I guess. Avoid capital letters, because then you have to hit shift, and for instance, that makes it harder. But also what you can do is you can just use the last two numbers of the year that the paper was published in. So the original Rosenberg self-esteem scale was published in 1965. At the time, it was I think it was one of the first, I'm pretty sure it was one of the first self-esteem scales. And if you put, for instance, esteem 65, that's very short, I would say. It's very easy to use. And at the same time, I have so many wrinkles on my head. And at the same time, those 65, the number 65, those two digits at the end, they keep that esteem label for you and for your scale. Yeah, you see? So it's very useful. It's a very simple thing. And it saves it for basically 100 years, right? So let's say another self-esteem scale comes out in 1991. There was one about state self-esteem. It's like more short-term self-esteem from Heatherton. And the idea then is you just update those last two numbers. So you can say, okay, esteem 65 is one scale, esteem 91 is one scale, esteem 95 is one scale, esteem 2000, 00, esteem 10, 10. And it saves that abbreviation for basically 100 years. And you can, the chances of two esteem scales coming out in 1 year are pretty unlikely. But if there are, there's still, it's still, I guess it's possible at some point that there are more than one scale, but there, let's say one names it SE65, self-esteem 65. One names it self-esteem 65, one names it esteem 65. There's many different possibilities that you can do, even if you're working on the same scale. Yeah. The other one that I suggest is periods. I would say it's real, but I think some people, they do prefer the underscore. But I think I would say the period is better. So we have don't use capital letters. I would use periods and the numbers at the end. I think those are the most effective. The underscore you have to hit shift for, so that's again more potential for error, but also takes up more space. It's uglier in my opinion, and especially in tables, space is at a premium. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, especially if you have like 10 variable labels and they're all underscore compared to period. Yeah. This is just the beginning, so there are lots of potential standards that can be set and improvements to be made in data sets and analysis scripts besides variable labels. Some that I mentioned in the paper are things like demographics. So there are certain variables that are in essentially every single data set that we create. And it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't make sense to leave those unstandard. Yeah, so I looked for the paper at about 50 to 100 data sets, and we found like 20, 25 different ways of labeling the gender variable. So yeah, it's a whole big discussion, but of course, gender is an evolving concept. But even when we're just talking about males and females, or sex, if you want to call it that, people call it sex, people call it gender, people call it Geschlecht, people call it male, female, people call it MF, people call it S, people call it tons of different names, and that is just for the label. It's a good example, I think, of the difficulty of labeling even such a simple variable, right? So you would think gender is such a basic, easy thing, but people name it a bunch of different ways. They code it a bunch of different ways. Is male 1 or is male 2? Should I use an M and an F? Should I use male? Should I use female? Should I use all kind of crazy different things? And that's just in English, right? So Frauen is F, but Herren in German is H. Let's say señorita and señora, señor and señorita. It's S and S. We can say meszka is men, it's M, and kobieta in Polish is K. So you see there, for a Polish researcher, M and K. If I upload data with M and K, and I come as an English speaker later, what in the heck does that mean, So, yeah. Lots of different things. Standardizing these sorts of variables that are in every data set, condition, participant number, where the data were collected, makes data easier to upload, first of all, because I can avoid creating new metadata. So the main problem, in my opinion, is that people want metadata. So in order to upload a functional data set, you need to upload good metadata. But that good metadata takes a lot of time to create, and it's difficult to create. I have to input for each variable, the question wording, the question labels, what the question labels mean, and it's a very annoying process. I did it. I was helping at some points redesign open science tools. It's a very frustrating process to do, and so standardizing it, we can just get rid of all of that because we know, okay, gender 2006, let's say, pretend. It has these standards, males are M and females are F, and that's it. And if I use gender 06, I think I said, I know that those are the standards, yeah? And it's very clear. If I use location, location 29, let's say, I know that it corresponds to maybe a geocode or something like that was developed in 2029, I don't want to say. And so I think setting these standards can be very, very useful for the field, and it's the future, I'm pretty sure. I would go so far as to say that the APA, which is like the major standard setting body in my field, they will, in their next update to the APA style guide, I'm willing to bet with the world right now that there will be guidelines. There are not currently guidelines for data sets and analysis scripts, but in 5 or 10 years, I think because they're becoming so popular to upload and they're becoming a standard part of the research package, they will have standards, have etiquette in the same way that citations or tables or other aspects of the current package have. I hope you learned something. Don't want to take up too much of your time. Yeah. Enjoy your day. Happy Easter. Give me a thumbs up. Oh, my back. Ooh. Ooh. See you guys.